The night was dark, yet the world outside was glowing like it was Christmas. Lights sparkled in the streets, and joy filled the air. Suho stood between his parents, his eyes shining with excitement and dreams. He looked up at his father, Jinwoo, and declared his dream of becoming a detective, just like him. Jinwoo, caught off guard for a moment, simply turned to listen as Suho continued, saying how cool he thought his dad was. Then, his thoughts bounced toward his mother, Cha Hae-in. He imagined himself becoming a track and field athlete like her, gaining strength and speed if he followed her path. He looked to her with hopeful eyes, asking if that would be okay. Cha Hae-in smiled gently and brushed her son's head with warmth. She reminded him of the promise she and Jinwoo made when raising him. They had decided never to force their dreams onto him. Whatever dream Suho chose, it would be his own, as long as it was something he truly desired. Suho, with a heart full of admiration, said he wanted to be strong and cool like both of them. Hae-in encouraged him, but also told him to always ask himself if that's what he truly wanted, not just to chase after someone else's shadow. Later, Suho didn't understand why, but those words from his mother stayed with him. At some point, however, he stopped asking himself those questions. He stopped wondering what he liked or what he was good at. Slowly, he began chasing after Jinwoo's path without thinking. He wanted to follow his father so closely that he lost sight of his own steps. In school, Suho was often seen drawing the same thing, ants. One day, the art teacher noticed this and commented on it. The teacher pointed out how his drawing skills wouldn't improve if he kept repeating the same subject. But Suho just smiled and explained that even though they looked similar, each ant had small differences. The teacher understood what he meant. They acknowledged that his drawings had their own charm. The more he drew, the more naturally his hands moved, giving each ant its own character. But then, the teacher pointed to one of the drawings and said something different. That particular sketch didn't even look like an ant anymore. Suho finally understood something important. The reason he had awakened the power of shadow transformation earlier than his father, Jinwoo, wasn't random. It was because the system had recognized something unique in him, his own traits, something personal and different from what his father had. He no longer wished to resist this truth. From now on, his combat style would embrace shadow transformation completely. He would not stick to any single form. Instead, he would shape and control shadows freely, like an artist painting without limits. As Suho's resolve solidified, something began to change. From within the shadows, Beru sensed a disturbance. The shadows around Suho were beginning to stir in unnatural ways. They were no longer just responding. They were being pulled in, almost as if they were part of something bigger now. Beru's form began to waver, and even he struggled to remain stable. Esil, who stood nearby, immediately noticed something was wrong. She rushed to Beru and grabbed him, concern filling her eyes. She asked what was happening to Suho, desperate to understand. But even Beru, who had seen countless battles and transformations, didn't have the answer. He could only guess. Maybe Suho was finally breaking out of the shell that had been holding him back. Meanwhile, the apostle, watching everything unfold from a distance, narrowed his eyes in suspicion. Until now, he had assumed Suho was no more than a fledgling monarch, a boy with potential but nothing dangerous. But now he began to doubt that belief. Something inside Suho had been hidden, something dormant and powerful. It was growing, and fast. The apostle realized he had to act quickly. If he let Suho awaken fully, it would be too late. He needed to push Suho to the brink of death and force a star fragment into him while he still could. But before he could make his move, everything changed. Shadows swirled violently around Suho like a storm, then pierced upward into the air like sharp shards of stone. The power surged with so much force that the apostle had to step back. His grip on Suho loosened, and he leapt away in alarm. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. According to everything he knew, a hunter's abilities did not grow. They remained fixed after awakening, but what he saw now looked like something else entirely. A second awakening. Suho's injuries, deep and bleeding just moments ago, began to heal. The shadows moved like living bandages, sealing the wounds and stopping the blood. His senses returned, sharper than ever. Then, slowly, his hands began to shift. Dark, sharp claws made of shadow replaced his fingers. From the dark abyss behind him, the shadow soldiers roared and emerged, answering his call. They assembled, ready for battle. Suho stood still, calm on the outside, but his eyes carried a new kind of coldness, a deadly focus that hadn't been there before. As he stood amidst his awakening power, a thought crossed Suho's mind. Shadow transformation wasn't just about turning shadows into weapons. A shadow's true nature was in its ability to shift, to take on different forms. That meant his power wasn't limited. It could evolve in countless ways. The battlefield trembled as the chimera charged toward the apostle, its jaws wide open, aiming to bite through the enemy in one clean strike. But the apostle was fast. With a swift motion of his blade, he slashed through the chimera, cutting it down instantly. The shadow soldier vanished into the air, completely destroyed without resistance. Just then, a high troll, another of Suho's summoned soldiers, took the opening and launched a punch from behind. It was a heavy, thundering blow meant to catch the apostle off guard. But the attack did nothing. The apostle didn't even flinch. He turned slightly and blocked the punch with ease, showing no signs of being affected. To him, this battle was already decided. The apostle reminded Suho of what he had said earlier. No matter how many shadow soldiers were sent his way, they would never be enough to defeat him. And he proved it again by swinging his blade and destroying the high troll in a single blow, dispersing its shadow just like the chimera. But Suho didn't back down. Instead, he activated a special skill, Bond skill, Demon Blast. With a surge of energy, he charged forward, determined to land a decisive strike. In his mind, this was the final chance. If even this didn't work, then perhaps nothing else would. He stepped down hard and dashed forward, crossing the battlefield in the blink of an eye. The speed was incredible, almost too fast to track, but the apostle remained calm. He sensed the magical energy Suho was releasing. It was powerful, dangerous even, but it wasn't enough to intimidate him. To the apostle, the attack was too direct, too obvious. In the very next moment, his blade moved, fast and sharp. It slashed multiple times across Suho's body as he closed the gap. Blood sprayed into the air. Suho's charge was halted mid-stride, and he dropped back, wounded. One of his legs had taken serious damage. The apostle smirked, looking down at the bloodied Suho. Losing a leg wouldn't stop Suho from using his powers, but it was enough to slow him down, enough to prove who had control in this fight. Suho gritted his teeth through the pain, but just as he tried to catch his breath, something unexpected happened. Behind the apostle, a presence emerged. It was Sheikah, the tomb warden. Suho's eyes widened in surprise. He suddenly realized something new. Shadow transformation can also be used to arm soldiers with weapons. Bam! A massive punch dropped from above, connecting squarely with the apostle's face. The impact echoed like thunder. The apostle's body was hurled through the air like a missile, crashing violently through boulders. The ground tore apart beneath him. His body skidded across the battlefield until it was buried in a pile of broken rocks. From a distance, Suho marched behind his shadow soldier, Sheikah. The apostle tried to rise. His mind was spinning, stunned by what had just happened. He had just witnessed a soldier, not the monarch himself, use a skill. That was unheard of. Even the original shadow monarch had never used authority in this way. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His jaw felt heavy, broken. Pain surged through him. He realized the truth. He couldn't speak anymore. Still, his body could move. He began drawing on the life force inside Lee Min-sung, trying to charge up his mana. He told himself he could still fight, but he also knew now that he couldn't afford another mistake. He had let his guard down. That was his failure. But something else felt wrong. A strange sensation rippled through his connection with Min-sung. Suddenly, a horrifying thought struck him. Lee Min-sung might have regained consciousness. Could it be that the blow from earlier had broken the apostle's control? He couldn't believe it. A low-ranked hunter had turned the tide. It was beyond humiliation. As he tried to force control back, something inside Min-sung began to push back. The apostle's hold started to crack, fragments of control falling apart. Then came the voice of Lee Min-sung, not controlled, not dominated, but clear, conscious, and defiant. His will poured out like a storm. He no longer feared death. He didn't care about glory or recognition. What he hated most was being ignored, being treated like he didn't matter. And now, if he couldn't be the hero, he would embrace the role he was given. If this was his final scene, he would end it on his own terms. Min-sung's resistance grew stronger. The apostle's grip on his body began to shatter into pieces. He roared with all his remaining strength, announcing his final act, not as a hero, but as a villain accepting his fate. As the apostle's presence began to fade, breaking away like dust in the wind, Suho stood before him. His fist, wrapped tightly with mana, began to glow with raw power. He didn't hesitate. In a single moment, he launched his fist forward. The punch struck Min-sung's chest directly. The impact tore through flesh and bone. Shockwaves rippled out behind him as his body arched backward. The battlefield fell silent. Time seemed to stop as Lee Min-sung stood frozen, his body stiff and unmoving. Agony surged through him, radiating from the gaping wound in his chest. His stomach had been pierced through, and with his jaw broken, even his final words remained trapped inside him. In that quiet, painful stillness, Min-sung reflected on everything. When the alien had first appeared before him, he believed it was a chance to fix the ruined world. But now, with his life fading, he realized how meaningless it all felt. Since the cataclysm, everything had gone downhill, and this was how it ended. Suddenly, a memory rose from the depths of his mind. Lim Taegyu's voice, asking if he wanted to work together. Min-sung cursed at the thought. Even now, in his last moments, he couldn't shake the memory of that man. Rage bubbled within him. He refused to be looked down upon. He was Lee Min-sung, the superstar, not someone to be pitied. And yet, when he looked up one final time, what met him was not scorn or hatred, but Suho's quiet, pitiful eyes. That look pierced deeper than any wound. As his strength left him, Lee Min-sung finally dropped to the ground, his life fading away with nothing but silence left behind. A message appeared appeared before Suho, he had leveled up. The urgent quest to eliminate Lee Min-sung, the apostle of the Atarim, had been completed. From a distance, Esil called out with joy. Beru, filled with pride, acknowledged that the young monarch had defeated the apostle. Suho stood quietly, his expression calm but thoughtful. In his heart, he believed that perhaps it wasn't the apostle who had the last laugh, but Lee Min-sung himself. Suho hadn't spoken much with him, but he could tell Min-sung was someone who had chased his desires to the very end. Beru watched him closely. It was the first time the young monarch had been forced to kill someone who was once human, and someone who shared a similar path. Suho stood in silence, deep in thought. The battle with Lee Min-sung had left something behind. Not just an experience point or a quest clear, but something deeper. Something within him had changed. Thanks to Min-sung, Suho realized something important. Ever since he had become a player, he had lived with clear goals. To find his mother and become someone who could support his father. But along the way, he had missed something. He had never truly found his own reason for fighting. That must have been why Min-sung once called him an ambiguous character, someone without a true ego or purpose. Suddenly, his mind flashed back to the battle at the end of the tutorial. The fight against his father, Jinwoo. In that moment, Suho had been filled with awe. Even though his father had stood before him as an enemy, Suho couldn't help but admire his overwhelming strength. A quiet wish had formed in his heart, the wish to become strong like him. But with admiration came frustration. When Suho had lost that fight, it left a deep wound. The gap between him and his father felt too massive, too impossible to close. And yet, standing here now, after all that he had been through, Suho found a new ambition forming inside him. He wanted to become stronger. Not just stronger than apostles or monarchs, but strong enough to surpass even his own father. That thought, bold and impossible as it seemed, filled him with fire. For the first time, Suho felt like he had found his own ego, his reason to walk forward. Beru observed him quietly, knowing full well how unreachable that goal might be. Esil too couldn't help but wonder if surpassing Jinwoo was even possible, but Suho, despite the doubts surrounding him, felt more focused than ever. He smiled inwardly. It was natural for others to question him. Instead of responding to their concerns, he turned his attention to something else. The notifications flashing in his vision. He had leveled up, rewards, experience points, all listed out before him. But something new had appeared as well. A quest. It was unlike the others. This one was for a class change. Curious, Suho opened his status window. His level was now 40. His class still showed as none, and his title remained Wolf Assassin. From a distance, the apostle stood quietly, far from everyone's sight, his gaze locked on Suho. He observed the battlefield with a calm but calculating expression, as if measuring every movement. The power Suho had shown had taken him by surprise. The apostle hadn't expected the one wearing the black mask to possess such potential, and now he had made a decision. Suho had to become theirs. As fragments of his true self had begun merging, the apostle had regained one of the core powers of his original form, the scales of equivalent exchange. This ability allowed him to trade anything he possessed for something of equal value. In this moment, he decided to exchange the life force of all the surrounding believers for a single thing, mana. Drawing on the energy around him, the apostle stretched out his hand. In his palm was a stimulant known as stardust, a rare material that drastically increased mana power. The air around him grew heavy as raw energy surged. Then, with flawless force and intention, he launched the stardust with deadly precision. Back near the battlefield, Beru asked for permission to search Lee Min-sung's memories, hoping to trace the origins and purpose of the apostle of the Atarim. Suho gave him the go-ahead, still reflecting on Lee Min-sung's final moments. He wondered if Min-sung had grown to hate the world after the cataclysm, and what might have happened if Suho had never become a player. But before he could finish the thought, something struck. His vision blurred. A sharp, burning pain shot through his body as the stardust pierced straight into his gut. Blood burst from the wound. Esil and Beru, frozen in shock, couldn't even react at first. The attack had come from nowhere, fast and unseen. Suho gasped, falling to his knees as shadows began swirling out from within him. He groaned in pain, gripping his head as an unfamiliar sensation invaded his mind. It wasn't just physical, it felt like something foreign had entered his thoughts, digging deep. A flurry of system notifications poured into his vision. One of them declared the activation of permanent longevity, but more importantly, it stated that the attempt to dispel the effect had failed. The system had identified the attack as similar to the infection caused by mist burn, a dangerous and lingering status. Multiple recovery attempts were made, but each failed. Far away, the apostle watched with satisfaction. To him, this moment marked a shift. With this success, the authority of darkness would finally be within their reach. But just when things seemed irreversible, another notification blinked into Suho's vision. The system had finally succeeded in analyzing the status effect, and recovery had begun. Still, Suho was trembling. The damage was far too great to ignore. His companions cried out in concern. Panic etched etched across their faces. Beru rushed forward, calling out for the young monarch, but Suho could barely speak. Suho tried to stay conscious, even as the pain burned inside him. The attack had been sudden, but the system had managed to activate permanent longevity just in time. The conversion had ended. He was alive, but the wound was still deep. Suho knew he had to do something fast. He focused on covering the injury using his shadow powers, determined to stop the bleeding and regain control. But something was wrong. His HP, which should have stabilized, was still dropping. Panic started to rise. If it continued like this, his body wouldn't hold out for long. There had to be a solution, something immediate. Without hesitation, Suho accepted the class change request that had been pending. The system responded instantly. A notification appeared, confirming that the class change request had been accepted and the process would now begin. A portal formed before him, swirling with dark energy. But there was a condition. Only Suho, the player, could enter the space for the class change quest. To protect the flow of the quest, the system separated him from his allies. His companions, including the descendant of a monarch, were teleported to the Shadow Dungeon. Suho stepped into the portal. As soon as he entered, it began to collapse behind him. Darkness surrounded him. The air was cold, the silence pressing. Suho couldn't see anything at first. For a moment, he questioned if he had died, but he could still feel the warmth of his own skin, the light sensation on his cheek. The pain from his stomach had vanished. That confirmed it. He was alive. A single torch lit up in the pitch black space. Its glow pushed back the darkness, revealing a vast empty hallway stretching into the unknown. Suho looked around, realizing that this place was more than just a part of the system. It had a strange, heavy presence, like something sacred or ancient. Elsewhere, back on the battlefield, the apostle walked toward the lifeless body of Lee Min-sung. He scanned the area and noticed the absence of magic power. The sudden appearance of the gate, who had taken away the black mask and his soldiers, left the apostle intrigued. The fact that Lee Min-sung had been left behind was a clue. It meant the gate that had opened was meant only for the black mask and his team. Another mystery. Every time the apostle crossed paths with Suho and his group, the unexpected happened. He found it fascinating. Meanwhile, inside the new realm, Suho realized something else. His body was completely healed. The hole in his stomach was gone. He felt no weakness, no pain. Physically, he was fine. But when he checked his status window, a restriction appeared. The heirs of other monarchs were not allowed to take part in the advancement quest. The system also denied him access to the Shadow Dungeon key. He quickly realized something was wrong. His bond skills weren't working, and neither was the Shadow Dungeon key. This was unlike any place he had entered recently. As he looked around, the layout struck a chord in his memory. This dungeon, it was the same one he had trained in during the tutorial phase. The very dungeon his father had created for him. Though he had grown far beyond who he used to be, the memories of that time still lingered. But this time, there were no knights to battle, no clear way to level up, and no weapons provided. Everything was stripped from him. It was a cruel twist, especially after the destruction of Vulcan's horn. Suho noticed that there were no quest details given either. No instructions, nothing to follow. It made him wonder, if he had to open doors and climb the tower like before, would he have to complete it all without any outside help, without powers, without his weapons or skills? He wandered through the dim hallway, feeling the place both familiar and foreign. The path was lined with twisting passageways, far more than what he remembered. It felt like a labyrinth. From every direction, distant noises echoed, faint sounds that made the place feel alive, even without anything visible. Eventually, Suho discovered a door standing alone in the middle of the path. It didn't make sense. A boss room placed randomly, with no real structure leading up to it. It felt rushed, like the advancement quest was put together without care. Still, something about the mystery ahead made him feel a bit curious. He reached out and opened the door. He stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. Would this room be the start of his growth, just like the old days? In the darkness, Suho noticed a large throne sitting at the end of the room. Someone was seated on it, though he couldn't make out their face clearly. He walked forward cautiously. As the shadows lifted with each step, Suho froze. Sitting on the throne was himself. It was the Suho from the tutorial, the version of him that had first been shaped inside this dungeon, the version that had defeated Beru at full strength. Suho remembered that moment, the power that version of him held. It was not something to be taken lightly. In that instant, the figure on the throne clenched his gauntlets tightly, the sound of metal tightening echoing across the room. Then, with explosive strength, he smashed the throne into rubble and stood, his eyes locked onto Suho with violent intent. Without giving Suho any time to react, the figure launched forward like a missile. The next moment was chaos. The gauntlet tore through Suho's body. Pain surged before his form was shattered into fragments. Everything disappeared in an instant. His scream vanished in the silence. There was nothing left. The three torches that had lit up when Suho entered the dungeon now stood dim. One of them had extinguished completely. Then, Suho opened his eyes again. He was back at the starting point. Everything was just as it had been moments ago. Confused, he looked around. Slowly, Slowly, realization hit him. This place allowed him to respawn, and what he had just seen, the enemy inside the boss room, it was him, his past self. The purpose of the advancement quest had become clear: to overcome his former self, the version of him from the tutorial, the one who had once stood as strong as Beru at his peak. Suho stood up, steadying himself in the dark corridor of the dungeon. The system had been designed for him to grow stronger. He knew that much. If his task was to defeat the presence lurking behind one of these boss room doors, then that meant there had to be a way to do it. Unlike the tutorial dungeon, this place had countless passageways, winding and misleading. The earlier boss room had appeared in an odd location, and that convinced Suho there had to be another boss door somewhere hidden. He moved carefully, determined to find it, and moments later, he did. Another door stood before him, unmistakably similar to the last one. Suho hesitated. His thoughts were spinning. He didn't know what was behind this door, but anything, even the unknown, would be better than facing the terrifying version of himself from before. With firm resolve, he reached out and opened it, but what awaited him inside was not a monster. It was a child, sitting among scattered toys, playing in a room that felt strangely familiar. The child turned, and as the light revealed his face, Suho's heart skipped a beat. It was him. The boy had Suho's own face, the face of his younger self. His eyes trembled with confusion as his gaze locked with the child's. Nothing about this felt like a normal dungeon. A twisted sense of memory and power swirled in the air. Was he really expected to fight a child, his own past self? Before he could act, reality itself warped. The objects in the room began to float as if the very laws of gravity had been undone. The child remained calm, but everything around him began to lift into the air. Suho's body froze. He couldn't move. It was a familiar sensation, the overwhelming pressure, the total paralysis. It was the ruler's authority. The child raised his hand and pointed at Suho. In one clean motion, he swiped through the air. In that instant, Suho's body vanished from the room. The door to the boss room remained open behind him, but Suho was no longer there. Another torch in the dungeon hallway flickered and went out. Two were now extinguished. Only one remained. Suho reappeared back in the same hallway, gasping for breath, disoriented and shaken. It took a moment before he understood what had just happened. His child self, without hesitation, had killed him, snapped his neck instantly, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Neither version of himself, neither the future him from earlier, nor this overwhelming child were opponents he could handle. Not yet. Despair slowly crept in as the realization hit him. How could anyone survive a trial like this? Then he remembered the torches. In the tutorial, he was given 3 lives. If 2 were already gone, he should have only 1 left. But when he looked up at the walls, it wasn't just 1 torch that remained. There were hundreds, thousands. The system had broken. A flood of urgent notifications filled his vision. The message was clear. A foreign substance, something not of this world, had interfered. An error had occurred within the system. Despite this, the mission remained unchanged. He was to defeat the being behind the door, and he could not leave this dungeon until his advancement was complete. Suho stared at the countless torches lining the corridor, each one flickering steadily with its own flame. A thought struck him. What if each torch represented a life? The idea gave him a moment of hope, but that hope was shaky. The system had been corrupted by some external force. The dungeon itself had changed, rules warped, logic twisted. There was no way to level up in this place, no safe zones. The quest had become deeply unfair, and Suho understood why. The system error. Because of it, there was no guarantee that the torches truly counted as lives. Still, he couldn't let doubt win. He had to keep moving forward. The layout of the dungeon was chaotic. Irregular passages, strange room placements, and sudden boss gates gave it the feeling of a shifting maze. If 2 boss rooms already existed, there was a good chance more were hidden deeper within. But the real challenge was the unknown size of the maze. He had time, perhaps unlimited time, so all he could do was search, one step at a time. While scouting, Suho came across the same boss room he had entered earlier. The door remained open. Darkness lingered beyond the threshold, and within it, a presence stirred. As he crouched down to observe it, something emerged from the shadow. A small creature stepped out. It wasn't alone. Behind it, Suho's child self-appeared once again. The toys the boy had been playing with earlier had now come to life, twisted into mockeries of soldiers. Suho's heart dropped. The child screamed and chaos erupted. Before he could even react properly, a searing pain tore through Suho's body. His leg had been ripped in half. He screamed as he looked down, blood pouring across the stone floor. One of the toy soldiers had launched a surprise attack, striking with inhuman precision. The child Suho stood behind them, directing the onslaught with silent authority. The floating presence around him confirmed it. He was using the ruler's authority. Suho could barely think. The speed, the power, it was too overwhelming. There was no way to defend against it, no room to fight back. The toys exploded with force, piercing flesh and breaking bone. Every movement from the child Suho was followed by brutal consequences. And then it got worse. Another figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Suho's version from the tutorial. That version radiated violence. Cold eyes locked onto the wounded Suho on the ground. Suho could feel it in his gut. There was no chance, no opening. He would die again. The tutorial Suho raised its fists, and the heavy gauntlet smashed down. Suho's body was torn inside out in a single devastating blow. Darkness swallowed him. As he respawned in the hallway, his breathing was heavy. He was still alive. That confirmed it. The torches did represent lives. As long as they burned, he could keep coming back. But the realization brought little comfort. The bosses could leave their rooms. They could roam the corridors freely, hunting him down. That level of difficulty was beyond cruel. He wondered if his father had gone through a quest like this during his own class change. It felt impossible. But if the system was broken, the only way forward was to endure it. Suho formed a new plan. The system still required him to defeat a being inside a boss room. That was the only clear condition. That meant he didn't need to win against the tutorial Suho or the child version of himself. Not if he could avoid them. So he set out again. He searched for another gate, but the result didn't change. Whenever he came across the tutorial Suho, it crushed him again and again. When he encountered the child version of himself, the toys and the ruler's authority tore him apart before he could run. Over and over, his body was destroyed. His lives diminished. But each time, he came back. He was losing, but not giving up. The flame still burned. He could keep dying, again and again. As long as those torches remained lit, Suho would continue the cycle. No matter how many times he was defeated, he would get up, because somewhere in that endless maze, a different boss room existed, and Suho was determined to find it. The dungeon floor was soaked with Suho's blood. Once again, his body reformed at the starting point. He had respawned. But something deeper than pain was now taking root in his mind. Doubt. The same question echoed inside him. What if there were no other boss room gates? What if the system error had erased his only chance to escape? He had infinite lives, but faced enemies he could not defeat, in a place where he couldn't grow stronger, couldn't level up, and had no allies. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was hell. Despair clung to him, but Suho's mind went back to a promise he once made, a declaration to himself in silence. If he was going to grow stronger, he wouldn't settle for anything less than becoming the strongest. That vow wasn't just a dream. It had become a chain that now bound him, forcing him to act even when every part of him wanted to give up. He gritted his teeth and wiped the blood from his lips. His hands, trembling with pain, dropped to the cold stone floor. Slowly, he began drawing. Each time he died, he would mark the path he took. Again and again, he would track his movements through this maze. If the dungeon wouldn't offer him strength, he would find a way to take it. Meanwhile, far away from the dungeon, Soul was caught in a storm of news. The Hunter Association had made an official announcement. Star powder, a stimulant popular among hunters, was now banned. For a long time, the drug had been praised as a miracle enhancer with no side effects. But the truth had surfaced. Many hunters who had taken it were now suffering from memory loss. An emergency investigation had been launched to identify the damage and trace its spread. At the center of the chaos stood a shocking name, Lee Min-sung. Once hailed as a hero among hunters and a former celebrity, Lee Min-sung had fallen into disgrace. He had been the former Vice Guild Master of the Reaper Guild, and also the key figure behind the distribution of star powder. That morning, a hiker had found his corpse on a remote mountain. The cause of death was unclear, but the implications were massive. The public was stunned. A man once seen as a symbol of strength and fame had become entangled in a criminal network, and now he was dead. In response, the Reaper Guild made a firm decision to fully assist the Hunter Association in the investigation, no matter the consequences. Inside the Hunter Association headquarters, tension filled the room. Lim Taegyu sat with frustration burning through him. His shoulders were stiff and his jaw clenched with guilt. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible for everything. If only he hadn't lost Lee Min-sung back then, perhaps this entire tragedy could have been avoided. Choi Jong-in tried to ease the burden, but the confusion only deepened. There were too many strange points. The condition in which Lee Min-sung's body was found was not normal. His physical appearance had changed, twisted in unnatural ways, yet he never possessed any kind of transformation skill when he was alive. That raised new suspicions. Jong-in considered a possibility. Could the effects be tied to the illegal stimulant star powder? Perhaps it had induced a new kind of transformation skill, but Taegyu wasn't sure. Another detail haunted him. During the final moments of Min-sung's life, a hunter wearing a black mask had been seen fighting him. That unknown figure might have been the one to deliver the final blow. Sitting nearby, Woo Jim-chul listened quietly. His mind focused on that same clue, a hunter in a black mask. That image lingered. Then Jong-in pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the table for all of them to see. It showed a young man, Suho. Official records listed him as a D-rank hunter, someone who should have been far too weak to be involved in such high-level battles, but judging by recent events, that rank might be false. Jong-in suspected the truth. Suho could be a false ranker, hiding his true strength under a fake status. Park Dojan, who had also become involved in the investigation, requested a closer look at the photo. He took it in his hands and studied Suho's face with growing curiosity. Across the table, Jimchul remained silent, but his thoughts were racing. The signs were becoming clearer. The hunter in the black mask was most likely Suho, but if another disappearance had occurred again, especially one linked to Suho, then this wasn't just a normal incident. Jimchul's mind shifted to a name he hadn't spoken aloud. Sung Jinu. He wondered what was happening to his son, Suho, and deep down, he hoped the boy was still alive. Back inside the dungeon, Suho's ordeal continued. The endless halls were unforgiving. He had died countless times, and with each death, the agony only deepened. Yet his will refused to break. Every time he was reborn, he would drag his body to the floor and trace the layout of the maze in blood. That became his only weapon, his only map, the only form of resistance he could offer. He was exhausted, broken, and overwhelmed by pain, but not defeated. Even though the dungeon kept killing him, even though no clear exit had shown itself, Suho refused to surrender. He wasn't ready to give up. Inside the shadow dungeon, the air had grown heavy with silence and worry. Ammut stood still, eyes scanning the space lazily as his sharp tongue lashed out at the one pacing frantically above. Beru was flying in circles, wings buzzing with restless energy. He hadn't stopped for days. His worry had turned into obsession. Beru's usual composure had long vanished. His voice cracked with emotion, his cries echoing through the empty realm. It had already been 2 weeks since Suho entered the unknown gate. There had been no news, no sign of his return. Beru couldn't sleep, he couldn't rest. The pain of not knowing ate away at him, and his desperation poured from every trembling shout. Esil stood nearby, quiet but concerned. She understood the emotions Beru was drowning in. 2 long weeks had passed without a word. Even though Suho had survived impossible odds before, this silence had become unbearable. Ammut's indifference only stirred more tension, but Esil tried to hold back judgment. Yet Ammut was not heartless. He simply saw Suho differently. To him, Suho wasn't a child in need of rescue. Suho was a fighter, one molded by agony, strengthened by unyielding resolve. Ammut had never met the Shadow Monarch, but he saw the same fire in Suho's eyes. Even if his body broke and his mind was pushed to its limits, Ammut believed Suho would survive. His words were blunt, but they carried a truth the others needed to hear. They had to trust him. Back inside the brutal dungeon, Suho was still locked in the cycle of death and rebirth. His body had become a tool, a vessel of endless punishment. But even in that loop, Suho fought. He charged forward again, fists clenched tightly with raw fury. This time he aimed directly at the version of himself that had grown cold and monstrous. Suho thought he might land a hit, but his enemy moved with ease, raising his gauntlet slightly, and Suho's body was instantly torn apart, shredded into pieces. Another life gone. He respawned and attacked again, this time leaping high into the air. His target was the child version of himself, the small but terrifying figure that had haunted this maze. He went in with a powerful dropkick, determined to take down at least one of the bosses. But before he could land, the child lifted his hand. The crushing force of the ruler's authority hit Suho midair and slammed him into the ground, lifeless once again. Death followed him again and again. He had stopped counting how many times he had died. The pain no longer scared him. It had become part of him. Yet each time he came back, he learned something new. After observing the status windows of his enemies, he discovered the truth. The small child, baby Suho, possessed no player levels, but his skill and ruler's authority had been maxed out. The destructive telekinesis that ripped Suho apart again and again came from that version of himself. Then there was the other opponent, Tutorial Suho. That version held the class of a soul striker and was a level 99 monster. Just physical contact with him caused devastating damage. That explained the hopeless difference in strength. These were no ordinary enemies. They were reflections of his own potential, refined and deadly. Even so, Suho did not stop. With every failure, he pushed forward. He had failed to reach any new part of the dungeon. The maze remained vast and unknowable, but amidst the repeated deaths, something within him had changed. The fear that once controlled his limbs, that had paralyzed his spirit, began to dull. It didn't vanish, but he had grown used to it. Suho charged forward once more, but the result didn't change. His body was crushed, and death took him again. There was no time to grieve. He respawned, driven by rage and desperation. With clenched fists and sharpened focus, he tried again. This time, he managed to get closer to the floating child, baby Suho, but he was still too slow. The invisible force of ruler's authority struck before he could land a hit. Death wrapped around him once more. Yet despite the cycle of dying and respawning, Suho refused to let go of his will. The agony that once threatened to shatter him now carved him sharper. The pain of dying still burned, but he had come to understand understand something deeper. Even if death here didn't carry permanent consequences, it was not something he could afford to take lightly. His instinct to survive had to stay alive. With every repeated death, his body, spirit, and resolve were becoming harder, more focused, more enduring. Again, Suho used the blood dripping from his body to add another line to the map he had been drawing across the dungeon floor. The crude maze made from dried blood was his only guide. His eyes scanned it carefully. There was one area left untouched, one space he had never reached. That meant it could be his only chance. His gaze locked onto the direction, and suddenly he realized something. His encounters with the enemy versions of himself were happening more frequently. It was as if they were trying to block that very path. Then, without warning, baby Suho appeared once more, floating silently in the air ahead of him. It confirmed Suho's suspicion. That child wasn't just wandering, he was guarding something. Suho sprinted forward, his mind racing with calculation. Ruler's authority worked with invisible force, an unseen hand that crushed its target without warning. But if Suho activated his own version of it and cloaked his body in the same force, then perhaps he could defend himself. As the familiar pressure from baby Suho's telekinesis rushed toward him, Suho released his own ruler's authority. The moment the two invisible forces clashed, Suho twisted his body and leapt. For the first time, he avoided the crushing grip. He soared past the tiny floating child, leaving him behind. His eyes locked on something ahead, something that sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. A passageway, one he hadn't been to before. He moved without hesitation, dashing with everything he had left. The blood maze had guided him to it. This was the missing piece. And then he saw it, a third door. It stood beyond the first two, quietly waiting, a signal that another enemy, another version of himself existed. One more boss awaited him. Suho's heart pounded. His instincts screamed. He was finally moving in the right direction, but behind him, he heard it, the echoing sound of footsteps. They were coming. The tutorial Suho moved like a flash of lightning, inhumanly fast. The pressure in the air shifted. Time was running out. Suho raced forward, eyes locked on the third door. A chilling thought ran through his mind. If the purpose of those versions was to stop him from reaching it, then once the Soul Striker caught up, everything would be over. There would be no time left. His heart pounded as he ran, but it was already too late. The tutorial version of Suho had already arrived. The monstrous figure dashed behind him like a living projectile, faster than a shot arrow. The pressure of his presence crawled up Suho's spine. Sweat poured down Suho's face, his breath sharp and uneven. In that single desperate moment, Suho reached the door. He grabbed the handle, flung it open, and slipped inside just before the figure could reach him. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside, Suho collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. He didn't know if that terrifying version of himself could open the door. He could only hope this space was sealed off, but there was no time to rest. Though he had escaped, he knew it wasn't the end. What mattered now was who or what was in this room. Based on what had happened so far, Suho assumed another past version of himself would appear. It could be him from the early days of the tutorial, or maybe even the one from before that. If not either of them, then who? His answer came soon enough. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping slowly with both hands gripping swords. It was another version of Suho, one that wielded dual blades. The weapons were instantly recognizable. One was the Fang of Rakan, the other was Vulcan's horn. Suho narrowed his eyes. This version must have been born from a system error. The items it carried, the way it moved, it was too precise to be random. Suho activated the status window. He laughed briefly. The stats of this opponent were low. Finally, someone he could beat. His own level and stats, especially strength, were far above this version. He launched himself forward, landing a flying kick, but it was blocked. The figure raised both swords and deflected the strike with ease. Then everything changed. The figure activated several skills at once. Buffs surged around its body. Its strength, speed, defense, and mobility were all pushed to their limits. Even its armor radiated power. Suho's eyes widened. He recognized the technique, body enhancement, the same ability that Ammut had once used, but the figure wasn't done. It activated more buffs, stacking layers of power. Before Suho could respond, the opponent unleashed a flurry of strikes. The skill was Storm Slash. Blades of energy slashed across the room in all directions. Suho darted through them, narrowly dodging each strike. Sparks lit the air as steel scraped against steel. He quickly drew his own dagger and activated the same skill, Storm Slash. The two forces collided. Their blades clashed in a violent storm, each strike sending shockwaves through the dungeon walls. Then, in a flash, a blade grazed Suho's cheek. A thin cut appeared, blood sliding down. He gritted his teeth and glanced at the dagger in his hand. He was relieved. This was the weapon he had chosen carefully, the one he didn't discard out of caution. Any other weapon might have already broken. Just as the clash ended, the cut on Suho's cheek began to deepen. A strange cold shiver crawled down his spine. In that instant, something invaded his mind. Memory Memories, scenes he had lived through, began flashing before his eyes. But something was wrong. He recognized the battlefield, the fight against Braki, but it didn't play out the way he remembered. The outcome, the feelings, the flow of battle. It was all different. His eyes widened. These weren't his memories. Another strike came and he blocked it, but not without consequence. The opponent's blade scratched across his forearm. Again, memories surfaced. Another unfamiliar vision filled his mind. Another life. Another world. It was then that realization struck. The more injuries he received, the more his mind was being invaded. These weren't hallucinations. They were mental attacks triggered by damage. Suho immediately leapt backward, dragging himself away from the figure's relentless strikes. His breathing grew heavier, but he couldn't pause. The figure, calm and calculating, looked straight into Suho's eyes. Without a word, he raised his hand and gave the command, "Arise." Darkness responded. The ground trembled and twisted. From the empty shadows, soldiers emerged. Creatures born from pure darkness, all charging forward as one. These were shadow soldiers from the abyss. One of them, tall and heavily armored, was clearly of knight rank. Suho clenched his jaw and blocked a blow with both his daggers. The force of the strike sent vibrations through his arms. He was at a disadvantage. The knight and the others attacked in tight formation, swarming around him with precision. Suho dodged and parried, but their sheer number and timing prevented him from delivering a clean counterattack. His thoughts raced. This battlefield offered no corpses, no place to draw shadows from. Yet his enemy had summoned them regardless. That meant only one thing. This version of Suho had somehow stored shadows even at level 32. His control over the Shadow Sovereign's power had reached an unnatural level. As Suho struggled against the horde, more memories flowed into his head. Experiences that didn't belong to him but were deeply familiar. This version of Suho had walked a different path. In that world, there was a different Beru, a different Esil, Gray, and Ammut. They had gone through the same chaos, but handled it differently, more calmly, more powerfully. He had resolved that situation without dying. The system had given that Suho trials perfectly tailored to his growth. And from those trials, that Suho had grown stronger, far faster than him. A Shadow Knight lunged forward like a missile. Suho raised his dagger, but didn't make it in time. The blade pierced his palm. Blood flowed, but he didn't back down. He held the weapon with his bare, bleeding hand, eyes filled with anger and confusion. Why were his trials always so cruel? Why did every path he walked push him beyond his limits? None of his trials had ever been fair. He had died hundreds of times here, and each time his enemies were unreasonably powerful. His growth came at the cost of repeated death, pain, and sacrifice. As Suho grappled with the knight, the dual sword version of himself crept behind him, but Suho reacted just in time. He shoved the knight away and spun around, blades raised, narrowly deflecting a fatal blow from behind. He had learned something through death and despair, through countless failures and resurrections. Doing nothing would never change anything. It wasn't the system's error that was holding him back. The problem was how he had used it. He now understood. The system wasn't there to raise him. He was the one who had to master it. His movements changed. Rather than waiting or defending, he changed his tactics completely. He launched his fist directly toward the blade that came slashing at him, interrupting the strike with sheer force. Then, switching his stance with flawless precision, he delivered a powerful kick that struck the figure's head with explosive impact. No longer was he moving by instinct or fear. Every strike carried intention. Suho didn't just want to win, he wanted to break free. He refused to continue on the path laid out by the system. From now on, his future would be shaped by his own decisions, not by any structure or design that had been forced upon him. As he shifted into a handstand position, shadows coiled around his leg, forming a weapon-like extension. With momentum behind him, he dropped a crushing kick aimed at his opponent, but the figure, sensing danger, dashed backward, tearing through the ground and leaving deep grooves in the stone. Suho didn't waste the opening. Using the small window with perfect timing, he lunged forward, fists clenched tight with rising power. He landed a devastating blow that sent the figure reeling. The hit was clean, direct, and absolutely crippling. The force was so intense it felt like it tore through space itself. Then came the roar. Mana exploded across Suho's body like lightning racing through his veins. With one last burst of strength, he drove his fist down with such power that the impact shook the dungeon. The air cracked with a sonic boom, and the entire room was engulfed in a cloud of dust and force. When the smoke cleared, notifications flooded his vision. The advancement quest was finally cleared. Suho had obtained a new title, the one who overcame adversity. It was a name given only to someone who had endured overwhelming odds and still stood tall. The title granted a unique trait. The more stamina he lost in battle, the more his stats would increase. For every 1% of stamina spent, he would gain 1% more power, a reward fitting waiting for someone who kept fighting even when every advantage had been taken away. More messages appeared in front of him. The system had begun analyzing his actions, observing his movements and decisions in the most desperate moments. It recognized that Suho had chosen to fight against impossible enemies rather than submit. Even after dying countless times, his mind had not broken. In a place where power could no longer grow, he had found growth, both physical and mental. The system described him as someone whose creativity would always find solutions in crisis, someone whose determination would inspire others and help them reach their goals as one. Now, Suho was presented with a final choice: the selection of a class. The first option was Shadow's Heir, a path where the system would help guide him in inheriting the power of shadows. The second was Soul Striker, a hidden class chosen based on past records. But it came with a price. All previous stats would be erased, and the shadow skill would disappear entirely. The third class remained unknown. It was the recommended choice, created based on what Suho had achieved during the advancement quest. It too would remove the shadow skill. This path promised something completely new, born from Suho's own actions. Each option came with a consequence. One would keep everything the same, one would return him to a past path, and one would strip away everything for the chance to evolve beyond limits. But after everything, after the pain, the deaths, and the suffering, Suho was done playing by the rules. He didn't choose one, he chose them all. With a cold, determined gaze, he reached forward and seized every single option. In an instant, the three classes merged into one raw, brilliant sphere of energy that surged into his system. Power swirled around him, shifting and changing everything at the core of his being. The system confirmed it. The advancement had been completed. Inside the Shadow Dungeon, silence loomed heavy as weeks passed with no sign of Suho. Esil stood at the edge of the dark realm, her face tense, her voice low with concern. 3 entire weeks had gone by without any trace of Suho. Beside her, Beru trembled. His eyes, normally fierce, shimmered with tears as he whispered Kroko's name. His thoughts fixed on Suho's safety. Even Ammut, usually calm and unreadable, now wore a troubled expression. Not a single update had reached them. No signals, no presence, no sign. It was beyond unusual. Even for him, this silence felt unnatural. Something was off. Just then, Gray shifted his gaze. He sensed it, a fluctuation, faint but familiar. And from within a ripple of space, Suho emerged through the portal. His expression was calm, almost teasing, as he stepped into the realm once more. Ammut greeted him with his usual composure, but Esil and Beru were stunned. Their emotions broke through as the realization hit them. Suho had finally returned. After all the waiting, all the silence, he stood in front of them again. Meanwhile, far away in Seoul, a heavy atmosphere settled over the Hunters Association headquarters. Tension was thick in the air. Yu Jinho sat anxiously, still waiting for any news, but there was none. Wu Jimchul stood nearby, his tone serious. Despite their efforts, not even rumors of someone resembling Suho had emerged. It was as if he had vanished completely. What was worse, a dangerous assumption was beginning to spread. Some believed that Suho might be responsible for the murder of Lee Min-sung. Jinho, unable to contain himself, rose from his seat. He refused to accept such claims. He knew Suho. He knew the kind of person he was. Jimchul agreed. He too doubted Suho had done such a thing. There had to be a connection to the mysterious invader, the Apostle of Atarim, that Suho had previously mentioned. Regret settled heavily on Jinho. In the past world, he had done nothing. Suho had faced every challenge alone. This time, he swore it would be different. He would not let Suho walk that same lonely path again. Just then, Jimchul's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was another report. How many times had it happened now? Dungeon breaks kept occurring without rest. And now, another one was spreading chaos. Outside, in the middle of the city, destruction had already begun. Monsters roamed freely across the streets, tearing through vehicles, buildings, and whatever stood in their path. Buses were crushed, cars flipped, and entire shops were obliterated. Hunters were already on the scene. They stood in formation, weapons ready, facing a towering beast that led the charge. One of the hunters raised a shield, but it shattered instantly under the monster's brutal punch. The creature then grabbed the hunter, its claws sinking deep into the man's body, and squeezed until screams of agony pierced the chaos. Desperation filled the air. The hunters were overwhelmed. Questions flew through the crowd. Why was such a large-scale dungeon break happening right in the heart of the city? Where was the Hunter Guild? They were supposed to protect this zone, yet now civilians screamed and fled while monsters unleashed carnage in broad daylight. From a rooftop far from the chaos, Dojan stood with a calm yet calculating look in his eyes. He watched the destruction unfold across the city streets. Flames, screams, blood, all of it was just noise to him. What he truly cared about was visibility. To enter the heart of the Hunters Association, he needed attention, not effort, not righteousness, accomplishments, and the more destruction there was, the faster it would spread. The more people talked, the more his name would surface. surface. That was how he learned the game worked. People didn't remember the first hunter to arrive, or the one who died trying to save others. They only remembered the one who went viral. As he observed the scene below, a hunter leaped into the frame. With swift precision, Jae-hyung slashed through the beast's open jaws, causing it to shriek and stagger. People nearby gained hope, thinking the tide might finally turn, but Dojan wasn't pleased. He saw the B rank as interference, someone who could steal the spotlight. With a slow movement of his hand, he prepared to make his move. Jae-hyung would need to be taken off the stage. Suddenly, the beast shifted, its presence intensified, its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mana surged violently. With one swipe of its powerful tail, the monster sent Jae-hyung crashing into a pile of rubble. His body smashed into the stones, and he fell unconscious. He never even saw what hit him. The beast didn't stop there. It launched forward with brutal force. It clenched its fist and drove it directly through Jae-hyung's chest before he could recover. Blood sprayed, bones shattered, and what was once a strong hunter was now nothing more than pieces scattered across the street. Silence struck for a moment as other hunters froze in shock. The scene was overwhelming. The ground was soaked red, and atop it stood the beast, proud and merciless, scanning the area like a predator waiting for its next victim. One hunter in the crowd trembled. He was barely standing, his legs weak, and mind flooded with regret. After barely managing to earn enough money for treatment and buying a weapon, he had returned to the field as a D rank, hoping to make a difference. But now he realized it had all been reckless. He wasn't strong enough. He couldn't protect anyone. Then the monsters charged again. A pack of them targeted the weakened hunter. They lunged toward him in unison. But before they could reach him, someone stepped into their path. It was Suho. Without hesitation, Suho smashed the first beast into the ground. Its body flattened under his attack like an insect under a boot. He moved fast, too fast. His body reacted on its own, tearing through one monster after another. Limbs flew. Screams ended mid-breath. The D-rank hunter watched from the ground, wide-eyed and trembling. The masked man, Suho, wasn't just strong, he was overwhelming. This was the same hunter people once claimed was just a D rank doing solo raids. But what he saw now was someone tearing apart the impossible with ease. Suho stood silently amid the chaos. His eyes were sharp, focused. This was the perfect opportunity. He had recently changed classes, and now was the time to test his new power, and the magic beasts in front of him would be the perfect subjects. With a commanding presence, he gave the order, "Arise." Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows burst forth from the corpses of the monsters, swirling and twisting unnaturally through the air. Dark matter surged like a tide, engulfing the space around them, but this time, something was different. The shadows didn't simply take form as new soldiers. Instead, they spiraled toward the living hunters around Suho. In a breathtaking transformation, the shadows enveloped their bodies, forming armor of pitch black. Their weapons, once standard and mundane, twisted into sleek obsidian versions of themselves. Shock spread through the group. The hunters looked down at themselves, overwhelmed by the sudden metamorphosis. Their gear had changed. Every piece now gleamed in black, infused with the essence of the shadows. Confusion echoed among them. Their voices trembled as they tried to understand what had just happened. Nearby, Beru was stunned. He stared at the phenomenon, his mind racing. The young monarch had done something unprecedented. This wasn't the traditional form change skill that altered his own gear. This was different. Suho had materialized equipment for others, granting them new strength through the shadows. Beru realized with awe that this was not a skill. It was a form of shadow-created items. The hunters felt the difference too. Their bodies moved lighter, faster, stronger. Beru's thoughts raced. Even the Shadow Monarch, Suho's father, had never achieved this. This was something entirely new, a unique ability tied to Suho's newly awakened class. And now, Suho stood not just as a monarch, but as something beyond. He had advanced to an irregular class, White Shadow. The power radiating from him made one thing clear. He was no longer just hiding in the darkness. He had stepped into the light with his own strength. As Suho's mask faded away, revealing his face to the hunters for the first time, he turned to them without hesitation. He asked those who could still stand to lend him their strength. From a distance, Dojan watched. His sharp eyes took in every detail of the transformation. He had never seen a power like this before. Suho wasn't like the others. This wasn't the darkness that fought alone in silence. This was something else entirely. It was a declaration. Suho was different, and he had no intention of walking this path alone. Having reached level 42, Suho Suho had truly become irregular, white shadow. But while hope stirred in Korea, across the ocean in India, the atmosphere was drenched in despair. Within the Asura Guild, chaos had erupted, blood soaked the floor, and the bodies of elite hunters lay scattered, lifeless. Among them was Ryo Singh. In his final moments, he whispered a regret, an apology directed to the one he admired, Suho. He had failed to uphold his promise and protect what mattered. His debt would remain unpaid. The halls that once echoed with pride now rang with silence and death. From the center of this devastation, a lone figure stepped forward. The one responsible for the slaughter moved with casual menace. His voice was cold and certain. He had heard of a young force rising in Korea, someone strong enough to destroy his underlings, someone dangerous. That person was Suho, and now, with fury and vengeance burning in his heart, the unknown figure made his decision. He would head to Korea, he would hunt Suho down, and he would ensure no one ever dared interfere with what belonged to him. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.